morning, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson, president of ITIF. I want to welcome you to this event on this notion of the broadband value circle and the changing dynamics in IT, information industries, and what that implies for how the industries are working and how what the implications might be for public policy. I think it's timely that we're doing this event today, given the announcement today in the paper about the potential, or perhaps indefinite, who knows, merger or purchase of Skype by Microsoft. It's sort of one more example of how dynamic these business marketplaces are and what the impacts are. So we're really pleased to be able to have Jonathan Sallet present a paper that he's written and released recently on this whole notion of the broadband value circle. Jonathan's going to present that for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll have comments by Michael Calabrese and Jeff Eisenach, and then I'll make a few comments. We'll have a little bit of a discussion, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. We will finish up no later than 12:45. I know it says till 1. We might finish a few minutes earlier, and there's obviously food back there if folks want it. So let me just quickly introduce folks. Jonathan Sallet is a principal now at O'Malley & Myers, and he has a long and distinguished background in technology policy. He's actually one of the people I respect the most in this town. He's just a very, very careful eye on thinking about these questions. In the Clinton administration, he was a senior advisor in the Commerce Department, where he advised the Secretary and the White House on a whole set of issues around IT and technology policy. Michael Calabrese is a vice president at the New America Foundation, which is a think tank here in town, and there he leads the wireless innovation project. Michael's been really one of the major thought leaders on spectrum issues, and in particular on the importance of open spectrum and unlicensed spectrum. So really pleased Michael to join us. And last but not least, Jeff Eisenach. We really have an all-star panel here. It's a great panel. Jeff, okay, where to start? Tell me. Navigant, thank you. Navigant Economics, which is a firm that Jeff helped start, which is an economic consulting firm focusing on technology and telecom policy. Before that, he was the founder of the Progress and Freedom Foundation back in the early 90s, which was really in many ways the sort of grandfather of all of our efforts. It was really the first think tank in Washington that focused on IT and telecom policy, and led that for many, many years before going off now to Navigant. So with that, we'll start with Jonathan.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob. And thanks to ITIF, and to Rob for all the leadership that you've shown in innovation policy over the last few years, as innovation has become both a more important part of our economy and of our policies. And also to Michael and Jeff for having the patience to read through this piece and come today and comment on it, which I appreciate. I want to talk for a few minutes about business, not actually about public policy. I know that's probably not the way conversations in this building usually begin, but I think it's useful. I think it's useful because business strategy, public policy, both work off an understanding of competitive dynamics. And what I want to suggest today is that the competitive dynamics in innovation spaces, we'll talk about mobile broadband, we'll talk about video entertainment, that they're changing. And they're changing in ways that I think require a new understanding of the nature of competition, which I'm going to suggest is more dynamic, more fast-paced, more uncertain than it was in the past, as companies play many more roles than they used to be. It used to be that being in this kind of business was like being in elementary school. You got assigned to your homeroom, and you stayed in your homeroom all year. But this is more like recess. Everybody's running from one place to another. Multiple people are racing in different directions, and people are changing their roles. In fact, they're doing many different things simultaneously. What does that mean? Well, think about Microsoft buying Skype. $8.5 billion transaction. At first glance, it doesn't seem so obvious. Why does Microsoft need Skype, right? We would traditionally think about Microsoft as a great proprietary software company. Skype is sort of a virtual communications company. One blogger writing today said, why exactly is this happening? That's the kind of question that led me to come up to suggest the notion that we should move from traditional market structures to circles. And I'll show you a picture of circles that look like that. Circles where companies can compete in very different terms than they could in the past. Because if you think about the last couple of decades, when I have been playing around with technology policy in DC, we've been through ups and downs, but what we've seen is different kinds of explanations. How should we understand the marketplace? Well, there's always a lot of emphasis on pure technology. There's a better search algorithm, and if we understand the new technology, then we'll understand the way the markets work. Sometimes people say, well, it's iconic leadership, right? It's no coincidence that in the last decade or so, both the CEO of Amazon and the CEO of Facebook have been the Time Magazine Person of the Year. Because we look naturally for people with great ideas and great vision. A lot of talk about the role of what we do as users. Blogging, tweeting, Facebook, uploading videos to YouTube as changing the marketplace. And of course there's the traditional value chain, which we all learned about in college, right? Hierarchical relationships with businesses. Somebody sells to the customer, somebody supplies to that, somebody supplies another level. Think of the way automobiles were manufactured in the 20th century, right? What I want to talk about today for a few minutes is a different approach. It's not a substitute for the others all are true. It doesn't explain anything. I offer it modestly as a possible explanation. But I do think it provides another perspective on what seems to us like a lot of chaos that seems hard to explain, like all those kids at recess. And here's the core concept of it, and I'll go through a couple of slides. Many different firms, seemingly in many different businesses, can bring new combinations of value directly to consumers. And they do so without having to go through intermediaries, while they collaborate with other firms, compete against other firms, buy from other firms, supply to other firms. And it's a constant dance that's moving. That's the dynamism of the marketplace. So let's start by talking about what the value chain looks like, right? This is a traditional value chain. Usually it's shown up and down, but here horizontal. In this value chain, right, there's a network carrier closest to the customer, then a device manufacturer who basically has to go through the network, and above that, search content providers, applications, and everything. There's a geography to this picture, right? The box on the right is the closest to the customer. It's the place one would think has the strongest customer relations. Now, that makes sense historically. Go back to automobiles. There were lots of people who made lots of money, I assume, selling windshield glass to automobile manufacturers in 1950. I'm sure it was a very competitive market, maybe, but I mean, a good market. But they were upstream providers. They were upstream, they didn't move out of the position. You bought the car from the automobile company. And it was the automobile company closest to the customer, who had the customer relationship, who offered the consumer-based value proposition. People upstream were suppliers. Now that changed over the course of the 20th century. Dell Computer in the 90s, making the value chain much more efficient, but not changing its essential character. Intel, right? People here remember perhaps the Intel Inside marketing campaign. What was that about? Intel was upstream of a computer manufacturer, and it had an ingredient that when you looked at your computer, you couldn't even see. So it was worried about having the problem of any so-called ingredient brand. It would add value to the product, but consumers wouldn't know. So the Intel Inside campaign, the sticker on the computers, was designed to let people know, hey, there's something inside here, there's an ingredient that although it may be upstream, it's important. So you should pay attention to it. But here's what Intel didn't do. Intel didn't go into competition against its customers. Intel didn't move out of the value chain It didn't become a downstream provider itself. And this is the way life worked, for example, in the wireless industry in the early part of this century. Device manufacturers felt they were one step removed from consumers, and that was a problem for them, and they wanted to have more control over what they were offered to customers, but they felt they had to go through an intermediary. And there was a lot of discussion about that. And then in 2007, the iPhone appeared. I'm going to use the iPhone to tell the story. It's not the only story, it's a good story, but it's one that we all know. iPhone shows up in 2007, and what happens? All of a sudden, there's a device that gets offered directly to consumers, right? Remember, Apple had a retail presence. It wasn't just going through AT&T, which was the wireless carrier. It was partnering with AT&T. It was in some sense competing against AT&T as they both sold the devices. But what it really was doing was bringing to the market a new value proposition that was directly attached to the Apple brand that consumers wanted, so that instead of being trapped upstream, it walked to the side of the carriers or anybody else, in essence, and said to consumers, we're going to offer you something you don't now have. You're going to value it. It's in economic terms. Apple was creating new surplus, new economic surplus. Some of that went to consumers. That's the consumer surplus. Some of it was divided between Apple and the other companies with which it was doing business, AT&T, for example. That's bargaining. This is an important point, and I want to pause on it for a second. One of the things that's characteristic of this market is there's lots of bargaining. And that's because, although I've given the iPhone as an example, there's lots going on a lot of the time. So, look at this slide for a second. It's in the paper as well. Here's one take. This is incomplete, right? This is just what I could fit on the slide. There's lots of other things that could have been up here equally important. But here's the basic proposition. Instead of there being a chain where one set of companies gets closer to that consumer, now any company that can get to the circumference of this circle can offer a combination of value propositions directly to consumers. That brings a lot more choice and a lot more competition to the marketplace. And here's what's also important. They can do it without all being in the same business traditionally. So walk around the circle. There are traditional wireless carriers. There's a content company. We'll come back to that. There's a bookseller, an e-commerce company. There's a search company. Microsoft, which we've mentioned before, we'll come back to, another carrier. And what each of these can do is create a value proposition with the combination of characteristics that they're competing against at the same time. So what are we seeing? We're seeing multiple companies reaching consumers directly. Secondly, we're seeing some companies play multiple roles at once. So if you look at Kindle, right, Sprint is a provider of an input into the Kindle in essence. But of course, although it's not shown on the slide, we all know Sprint is a very important direct seller to customers. So Sprint is just one example of being both upstream and on the circle at the same time. Thirdly, companies are simultaneously cooperating, competing, buying, supplying. Look at Google and Verizon. So Google creates the Android software. It's a supplier of the software to Verizon. Verizon is in some sense a user of that software. But at the same time, Verizon is supplying a competing operating system through the iPhone. So it's competing, it's cooperating with Google, in some sense being supplied by Google. At the same time, it's competing with Google by offering a competing operating system. And by the way, Google offers its own devices in direct competition to the devices that Verizon is offering, operating on different wireless networks. Nobody thinks this is strange, right? Nobody says, well, gee, each company should just work with one other company. Things ought to be just, you make your deal. Nobody thinks it's strange because this is all moving at once. The fourth point about this is consumers are at the center of the action. And this is what I mean. In today's marketplace, consumers are co-creators of value. They're not just taking stuff. right? So here's an idea for a business. Put up a website, don't create any content. Invite people to supply the content on their personal lives for free. Sell advertising. Right? This is Facebook. It's a great business model. And I don't mean to make fun of it. It's a great company. But the point is, without the involvement of the consumer as creator, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, just to take 3 examples, wouldn't have a value proposition. And we've seen that sometimes, right? When people are unhappy with Facebook privacy practices, the users say no. And they have an ability to do so because they're co-creators of value. Finally, if you're trapped, like out here, if you can't make it to the circumference of the circle, you're in trouble. Nokia. Right? The Nokia is a very successful company with a big market share in its operating system. The Nokia CEO writes in a really interesting memo that comes out earlier this year, in which he says, and I'm paraphrasing, "We have failed." Why have we failed? Well, he doesn't say the technology is worse. He doesn't blame the leadership. He's a new CEO. He doesn't blame the leadership. He says everybody else has gotten themselves into an ecosystem of companies, sets of partnerships and alliances. And we didn't. So we never got close enough to the customer. And so we have to do it differently. What happens? A few days after the memo, Nokia announces it's going to use the Windows operating system on its mobile devices, and there's a new kind of collaboration between Nokia and Microsoft. So this is a world of new competition. Firms are no longer defined by what used to be their product category, right? They're able to cross over, they're able to do business with others, in part because of an economic concept of modularity. It's very easy to mix and match different pieces, right? You can take your device, your network, your applications, and create multiple combinations of them. In part because the value is being expressed directly to consumers, so whoever, business people sometimes say they own the customer. Nobody does in this marketplace. But the companies with the brands, with the customer relationships, get bigger bargaining power. And this dynamic works again and again. The iPhone in 2007 set off a competitive dynamic that's still playing out. Indeed, played out at the beginning of this year, when for the first time in the United States, the iPhone was available on multiple networks. Now, this isn't the only market. I think this is a marketplace where this is really fully realized. I believe this is a good description of the market. There's others that's less obvious, but maybe worth talking about because I think it's coming. Let me just pause here, because I go fast. Is there any just questions about what this illustration is? I mean, I've tried to go through the main points, but I understand that it may not be intuitive. And everybody, does it sort of make sense what I'm saying about the need? Okay. So let's look at another marketplace. This is, if you think of video entertainment programming, and I'm sort of leaving out of, this is a little artificial because I'm leaving sports out of it, which is important, but to take a look. There's a lot of really interesting experiments going on in this marketplace. One that economist Jeff talks about is the question of one-sided, two-sided, multi-sided markets. Where do you get your money from, right? So think iTunes or Netflix. That's a subscription service you just pay for. Think of Hulu, basic Hulu, advertising supported. It's simultaneously appealing to two markets, consumers and advertisers, but does so by offering services for free to consumers. Hulu Plus, or the only Hulu you can get on your iPad, I believe at the moment, a two-sided market, but you have to pay. Consumers pay and there's advertising. So this is a really interesting topic in and of itself. And it's an example of all the experimentation that's going on. But let me just concentrate on two questions here that illustrate what's going on, I think. Do content creators need to have direct relationships to consumers, the movie studios? And conversely, is the competition for distribution, think Netflix, being commoditized? Now let me say what I mean by commoditized. Because it's always a threat in this kind of circumstance, because there's so many people creating value propositions. By commoditization, I mean that a firm creates something that's important enough to be included in successful packages, right? Other businesses want access to it. But the firm doesn't have a strong enough connection to the customers to have a very powerful bargaining position vis-a-vis other players. In other words, if we simplify this circle, I mean, there's lots of players here, right? Samsung with devices, iTunes, Netflix, Google, YouTube, TiVo a device, Xbox, Connect, which will come back to a device, Time Warner content provider. But let me just give you one quick story on this because I know I'm running long. What makes content, this kind of content, movies and TV shows, valuable? So traditionally in the movie and TV industry, there's been a very simple answer. At least it's been part of the equation. It's new. New content was a fundamentally different market than old content, right? You went to the movie theater to see the new content. And the old content showed up on, if there is such a thing still, network television. They were very different things. But that was important because the business model of the studios was built on the fact that that the content was divided in different product buckets, and they weren't very much interchangeable. Or as an economist might say, there wasn't a lot of cost elasticity of demand. Now think about Netflix. $9 a month, streaming all you want. Poses the question, do you really care if you're watching an episode from season 5 of 30 Rock? For the about 4 million people in the United States who do watch 30 Rock. Do you really care whether it's an episode from season 5? Or are you just as happy with an episode from season 2? Because if you are, this traditional distinction is broken down, and there's a threat to the whole business model that Netflix is carrying out. Now, there's a flip side of it. Maybe Netflix and other distribution carriers themselves are in threat of being commoditized, because at the end of the day, in a couple of years, what distinguishes a pure pipe, if that's what Netflix is? And I don't want to be unfair to it, right? The search algorithm in Netflix, the user interface, there's a lot that makes it valuable. But when Netflix goes out and purchases the exclusive rights to a TV show for the first time, House of Cards, which might have been bought by HBO, now you're asking yourself, is there a play here to prevent distribution models from being commoditized? And why is that important? Because it goes to who has bargaining power. Let me finish with just another example. We started off talking about Microsoft Skype. So there it is. There's Connect, Xbox and Connect. Anybody here got Connect at home? This is too bad because it's actually good because it means my following explanation cannot be rendered incorrect. So the New York Times today says, why does Microsoft want Skype? Here's what the Times suggests. Microsoft would be able to leverage Skype's more than 600 million registered users into using its other products. For example, it could be connected to Microsoft's Xbox 360 and Kinect systems. In other words, the suggestion is that in this kind of marketplace, where you may know Kinect allows people to watch movies, it's a device through which Netflix can deliver films. Now, Skype communications capacities can be brought to bear on it. This is the hypothesis. How might that work? I'm making it up, but if you're at home and you want to have a chat with somebody who's watching the same movie someplace else at the same time, maybe Skype helps do that. And of course, it's not just important here. Go back to this one. Here's Microsoft again. Another suggestion that a blogger made today is that Skype would allow Microsoft to come out with smartphones where so-called VoIP services are fully integrated for the first time. In other words, I've presented these as two different markets, but the Microsoft Skype deal today may suggest that even that's an oversimplification. That in many ways, we're seeing companies that are crossing these distinct markets, even in this depiction. Microsoft, Google, Apple appearing on all of these slides. So, just to sum up briefly, what I'm suggesting is that this concept of a value circle is worth thinking about, that's all. I think in mobile broadband it really feels to me like it is what described, it's a good description of what's going on. In entertainment, it may be. I think there's a lot, in the paper that's outside, I go through a lot of reasons to think it is, but they're not definitive yet, because there's so much experimentation going on. What are the characteristics of a market where there is a value circle? So I think they're these. Many companies, traditionally associated with very different markets, are nonetheless competing against each other and offering combinations and packages of value. Secondly, a lot of bargaining between firms as they play different roles simultaneously. Third, the market is dynamic and swift, and it moves, and there's a lot of products being introduced in succession. Fourth, the person at the center of the circle is playing a fundamental role in the creation of value, not just being a recipient of it. Next, all the players are making strategic decisions amid conditions of really deep uncertainty. In other words, one of the things that happens when there's so many potential competitors doing so much at once is it becomes very difficult to know where the next competitor is going to come from or the next competitive offering. And finally, consumers are benefiting directly from new forms of value that are embodied in this kind of marketplace. So where do we go from here? As I said, this is a business, this tries to be a business description. I say at the end of the paper that there's 3 things that one could do in the future. Additional research into other markets. Think healthcare. Healthcare is a market where productivity, IT productivity has traditionally been low, but lots of people can touch the customer. Pharmacists, internet companies, doctors. Maybe it's worth looking at other markets to see if they exhibit this characteristic. Second, public policy. I wrote a short paper a few years ago as part of an FCC reform. I do some work with silicon flat irons at the University of Colorado, where I suggested that in a market with a lot of uncertainty, it's a good place to emphasize case-by-case adjudication, because it's hard to forecast the future. And finally, business strategy. I hope what this shows is that there is no single business strategy that's going to be successful, that what we really are looking for businesses to do here is to experiment, not just succeed the first time, right? Google introduced its first device and it failed, and it came back with another one. To learn, to adapt, and to bargain with each other, because the bargaining is what is creating new value being delivered to consumers. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, John.
Thanks for having me, Rob, and it was great to have a reason to read this excellent paper very carefully. It's I think it really provides insights into how markets are changing that will prove very useful to policymakers and of course to industry players as well. Thanks to the disintermediating power of the internet, I think we are seeing a shift from a largely linear value chain to the economics of the value circle, as Jonathan describes it, with potentially big payoffs for innovation and consumer welfare. In the economics of the value circle, packages of complementary products and services can be assembled by one of the providers, by more than one in partnership, or even by the consumer herself or himself. And I think that's a really important part of this. I agree the value circle is a useful description of how the internet ecosystem can transform the relative roles of market players and produce more innovation and consumer welfare than the traditional value chain. And I hope Jonathan or somebody else is able to continue that analysis and extend it to other markets such as healthcare and journalism and so on, as he suggests at the end of the paper. So I'll make 2 overall points. One is that I find the transformation, and this is a little bit contrary to Jonathan, I think I find the transformation of the video programming market, while not yet complete, to be a more convincing example of the broadband value circle than today's mobile broadband market, which I think Jonathan believes is kind of more of a developed, good example of that. When you compare the wireline and wireless value circles, I believe it reveals that much of what Jonathan celebrates about the iPhone and Android, for example, was mainly a reaction to the market power of the dominant wireless carriers, that they are exceptional breakthroughs in a market that remains suboptimal for consumers compared to the wireline broadband ecosystem. And so I sort of wish, although I guess the paper couldn't go on forever, it had actually compared wireline and wireless, so I'll double back to that. Second, I believe that Jonathan's value circle analysis of both markets for video entertainment programming and mobile data service points up the importance of competition policy, or the lack thereof. For example, for all its innovation, the mobile broadband market would be generating far more surplus for consumers and for the companies in adjacent markets, including Apple, if we had first consumer handset choice, the Carter phone rules we have in the wired world, complete interoperability among networks, as we do with Ethernet in a wired world, but which we don't have, or which we have, for example, with the electricity grid and all the things that attach to that, or in transportation, and one or more open wholesale networks, which Sprint may be pushed to gradually, or we may see with LightSquared, but which we don't have yet. As I said, I find the broadband value circle analysis compelling as a description of the ongoing transformation of the video programming market. Even 5 years ago, we had two largely separate and traditional value chains, one for motion pictures and one for TV, and almost none at all for the distribution of very small-scale, independent, and social production. In other words, your own stuff. Product moved typically from studio, in this linear chain fashion, right, from studio to the theater or network TV, and then on to DVD rentals or cable rebroadcast. There wasn't as much choice. There wasn't as much of a long tail. Now the market is becoming mix and match, with firms playing rapidly evolving roles that are both complementary and competitive with one another. And consumers are also newly active as creators and as curators of content, hence Jonathan's example of YouTube. My quibble is with the suggestion that these same value circle dynamics have fully transformed the market for mobile broadband. I think a direct comparison of the wireline versus wireless ecosystems would reveal that the innovation we've seen in mobile has been driven by the need to end run the market power of the dominant carriers and the lack of consumer choice. Elements of the two broadband ecosystems, wired and wireless, are basically the same, right? They all the sort of the different product markets, you might say, are components that combine in different ways. Connectivity, devices, applications and software, content, search, advertising, e-commerce. Jonathan mentions all these and are present in both cases. They're the building blocks. Jonathan concludes that the ecosystem is the circle of firms in various product markets. But much of the strategic partnering and bargaining over economic surplus in the mobile broadband space reflects the fact that it is extremely difficult for players to reach the consumer directly. Consumers cannot do it yourself. They cannot assemble the pieces into their own packages the way you can in the wired world. And as a result, consumers do not enjoy choice or consumer surplus to nearly the degree that they do in a wireline ecosystem, or that they are already in video programming. In wireline, a consumer can readily combine and mix and match 4 or 5 of those different components or ingredients that I mentioned from distinct product markets to meet their own needs and budget. Connectivity is just one a la carte ingredient. It does not exercise control over the other product markets, the adjacent markets, for devices, applications, software, search, and so on. And much of that's because of the end-to-end nature of the open internet, which has just been, to a degree reinforced by the recent open internet hope. But this is not the case in wireless broadband. In fact, Jonathan does describe how pre-iPhone, that long ago era before mid-2007, companies in complementary and potentially competing product markets, devices, operating systems, apps, content, they were limited to a value chain relationship with the carriers. The carriers were the gatekeepers. That is, they were limited to being ingredient providers to the master chef, who not only dictated the recipe for the package that the consumer would receive, but could also readily deny any of those other players direct access to consumers. This pre-iPhone market looked very much like the value chain controlled by the manufacturer of cars, for example. Yet, and yes, the iPhone broke through. It does exemplify a new mix and match ecology that could emerge in wireless broadband and greatly benefit consumers. But to me, the iPhone is more the exception that proves what continues to be the general state of that market. Apple had to bargain away a considerable share of the economic surplus it created that would have been its own for the taking in the wireline ecosystem or in the consumer electronics market. It didn't need to give the iPod a share of its iPod value away, or even with iTunes it managed to do that without exclusive partnering and divisions of revenue. And Google had to give away its operating system for free in order to strengthen the hand of other manufacturers against the carriers and against the exclusive closed model of the Apple AT&T partnership. Unlike the disintermediation of the wireline ecosystem, or what's rapidly emerging in video programming, the carriers continue to mediate most of the inputs into the ultimate value proposition for consumers. It's the rare company that has the power, like an Apple or innovative breakthrough, to sort of get to the consumer in that market. So there's some implications of this for policymakers that I think are particularly interesting, in addition to what Jonathan talked about. So first, we need to be conscious of shaping a competition policy that encourages the economics of the broadband value circle. We can't just pretend the market is going to take care of it. In the mobile broadband market, a more truly pro-consumer transformation must include policies that the Apples and the Googles are sacrificing economic value to try to replicate. That is modularity, which Jonathan said is actually a feature of a value circle market. We don't really have complete modularity. Interoperability, which the FCC just began with its roaming order, but which we don't actually have technical interoperability of devices. Carter phone rules for consumer choice to use any device, take it between carriers. And open wholesale network, which we might get, for example, as a condition on the reallocation of the mobile satellite spectrum. There's a company called LightSquare that plans to build out a nationwide wholesale wireless network. And in fact, as a commercial, we're doing an event on that Thursday at lunch, the National Press Club, if you'd like to come. But those are the sort of competition policies that will be needed to fully realize the benefits of the value circle in mobile wireless. I don't think we're there yet. In the video programming market, the transformation is truly pro-consumer, but the value circle is a bit at risk. So on the one hand, we have non-discrimination in the disintermediation of these programming distribution. And that's what's creating the value circle, that's what's driving all the things that Jonathan talked about. And that looks like that may hold. But now, so what's coming up is sort of the alternative ways for carriers to try to kind of grab that value back. One is usage-based pricing that bears no relationship to congestion. It's simply a way, because they're all video sellers, a way to disadvantage a company like Netflix or others that would be selling content over the internet. And similarly, toll charges by ISPs at the last mile to the transport of video, for example, that their customers have requested. So in other words, you pay, this is the dust-up that occurred late last year between Comcast and Level 3, for example, where an ISP, people pay a subscription fee because they want to watch something like Netflix, and then when, say, a company, a transport company like Level 3 goes to deliver that to the last mile, the ISP could, and it really hasn't necessarily happened yet, but they could say, well, wait, we want to put a toll gate up, and again, that can sort of disadvantage the competition among all the different video providers. So I think those are the competition policies that we need to keep an eye on if we want to optimize the benefits of the value circle.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Jeff? You're not going to disagree or anything, right?
I'm going to try to stay on task because there were a couple of things there I might not have fully figured. Does this have connectivity even?
No, it's Jonathan's.
Do we have, I don't think it does, but remember, we only would have 3G.
That would work. Put a card in that. That would work. Somebody wants to play with that while I'm talking here. So Rob, thank you for having me here. It is, I do consider it an honor to have an opportunity to comment on Jonathan's paper, which I think represents a huge step forward in the direction of kind of a more, a richer understanding of competition in the internet ecosystem. And I guess what I want to focus on is a little bit is what we mean by that, and in particular the role of broadband in the internet ecosystem, which will eventually bring me around, I guess, to Michael's points. Avoid the use of adjectives. To Michael's points. So let me first start by commenting on just a couple of thoughts on Jonathan's paper, per se. First of all, I think, so what I want is, what I want is the Google homepage. There we go. Well, I'll start with the end. Look what it says. Nexus S now available on 4G. Michael, looks pretty modular to me. You can not only get it, by the way, from Sprint, you can get it on T-Mobile, or you can buy it from Best Buy. Where's the lock-in? Where's the lack of choice that Michael was just talking about? So I was going to say that for the end, but I couldn't resist. So the bottom line is everything that Jonathan said about the wireless space, I think, is correct, and I'll come back in a second to Michael's point. But let me make a couple of comments on Jonathan's papers first. First of all, I think the most constructive innovation of the broadband value circle is the notion that the consumer is in the middle of it. And that, I think, is crucially important in two respects. One is, we really do now have dozens of firms in the internet ecosystem all competing for the consumer's favor. And they are competing, as Jonathan says, amongst all of themselves, not just among some subset of network providers or device makers or operating system makers or search engine providers. All of those firms are competing to create and be part of platforms which create value for consumers. And at the end of the day, it's the consumer and the consumer dollar. I mean, it is competition, right? Back to the notion of who's in charge of consumer sovereignty. What drives all of this at the end of the day? It is that somebody is trying to get a consumer to spend $1 on something, or trying to get a consumer to show up for something so that they can charge somebody else for the value of bringing that consumer to the table. Right? At the end of the day, it's all about the consumer. Putting the consumer in the center is number one. That's absolutely right. The second piece that I don't like as much is that it's flat. And that's, we're all stuck with this flat stuff that comes in two dimensions. But it's flat, and it as it's broadband-centric in the way it's presented. And if you think about it, so just think for a second about kind of definitionally, it's kind of conventional to say that the internet ecosystem has 4 components, or 4 zones, or whatever you gardens. We'll talk about ecosystem in a minute, what that means. It's kind of a funny way to think about it for consumers or for economists and ecosystems. It's an ecosystem, I'm not talking about that. The 4 components are content, communications, applications, and devices, right? So let's just sort of define an internet service or product or value proposition as something that's got to have at least one of each of the 4 of those. Okay, something to look at or hear or hits your head, content, some way to manipulate it or see it or something, an application, some way in which it presents itself, a device that it presents itself on, and by definition, you're connected to some kind of communications network, right? So we have 4 components. And they can all come together in different ways. Right, so that feels 3-dimensional to me. I mean, you can think about a cube with 4 cube pieces of it. Think about it, really, I think about a molecule. Right, so I don't want to go there. There's a wonderful book called Bionomics, which I think I've got to go back and now get a copy of. People who've been doing this like Joe for a long time will remember Bionomics. Michael Rothschild, I finally just remembered his that I think probably, as I recall, talks about all this stuff. But I think the metaphor here is more 3-dimensional. I think that's richer. And I think the other thing that's captured by kind of a molecular notion is we all have the notion, we can all kind of envision, maybe from movies in science class, the notion of molecules kind of coming together and breaking apart again. And that is what happens, right? Platforms come together and then they break apart. And that's what's going on in the internet. In the internet ecosystem. Now, let me talk for just a second about the role of broadband in the internet ecosystem. In its comments on the National Broadband Plan, the Department of Justice, right, that's a pretty conventional source, concluded the following: broadband services are one part of a wider information technology ecosystem. Wider information technology ecosystem that ultimately delivers value to consumers. Right, so if you go to the Open Internet Order, you'll see the word ecosystem. If you go to the National Broadband Plan, you'll see them talking about a broadband ecosystem. That's right. But the notion of ecosystem is all over the place. Right? What is it, right, to an economist? I mean, you ask yourself the question an economist got to ask, what exactly does it mean for something to be part of an ecosystem? So the answer lies in a couple of concepts like Jonathan talked about. One is modularity and the other is complementarity. Right? So modularity, Jonathan talked about, is the notion that things work together. And complementarity, if you remember Econ 101, is the notion that when you put tea and milk together, you get something better than either one of them. Right? People like to consume things together. So cell phones and networks, right, are complements. You put those ideas together. So, and what you get is the notion that all these complementary modules come together to form a system, this molecular thing I was talking about. So to say that a product or a service is part of an information technology ecosystem is to say that it is one of the complementary modules operating together on one of these platforms, which all together make up kind of the platform of platforms, the internet. Right, so I want you to think about this. We've got applications, content, devices, and networks. They come together, they form platforms. Some of them look like iPhones, some of them look like Kindles, by the way, where you don't even know who is providing the network. Right, some of them look like Skype voice, where again, who's providing the broadband backhaul is irrelevant. You're using the telephone, but it happens on some sort of computer device instead of a standard phone. And again, the network is invisible, right? So we're putting these modules together in lots of different combinations in platforms that we hope create value, and which will get consumers to either show up and create value for somebody else or pay us money, right? So when you think about it this way, we'll skip over some stuff. I want to be time sensitive here. When you think about it this way, the thing that I think becomes clear, or at least becomes clear to me, is that from the perspective at least of competition policy analysis, as opposed to engineering diagrams, that the central metaphor, the defining metaphor by which everyone at the FCC and every place else thinks about broadband policy and the internet today, which is the notion that there are some things that are at the core, and those are called networks, and there are other things that are at the edge, and those are called content applications and devices. That metaphor is wrong. Right? It is economically incorrect. Every platform, every system has an application. Every system has an operating system of some sort and has content. Every platform has a device, and every platform's got a network. You need one of each. And maybe you need more than one of each, but you need at least one of each. So it's easy to understand that just as, how did we get to this misconception? How did we all become so broadband-centric in our thinking? Michael's point. Right, what is Michael focused on? Not worried about the fact that Microsoft has had a 90% share of the operating system market for the last 20 years. Not worried about the fact that Apple dominates the market for music downloads. Right? Not worried about the fact that that Facebook seems to have captured market power in the market for social networks. Michael's focused on infrastructure. Right? Now, in a way, it's not surprising if you think about where we are and who's calling the shots and who's paying the bills. Right? Just as pre-Copernican astronomers standing on Earth and looking at the universe from their earthbound perspective came to believe that the Earth was the center of the universe, it is unsurprising that today's telecommunications intelligentsia, looking at the world through the lens of the Federal Communications Commission, which is what attracts all of the money and all of the power and all of the attention and all of the focus, would conclude that broadband is the center of the internet ecosystem, but it is not. It is a module among modules, a complement among complements, an important one, an essential one, but no more essential than, for example, operating systems. So I'm going to stop here with one last thought. Okay? In its open internet order, the Federal Communications Commission seeks to distinguish broadband and infrastructure from other modules. It says it's different from content applications and devices. And how does it do that? It says that they're different because they, quote, control access to the internet for their subscribers and for anyone wishing to reach those subscribers. Does anyone doubt for a heartbeat that if collectively the producers of operating systems for personal computers and cell phones decided to cut off our access to the internet this afternoon, that they could do so by sending a command to our personal computers and cell phones? If you do, you're not paying attention. Okay? And if they couldn't do it this afternoon, they could do it next week. Together as a group, any group of application, all of the applications providers, all of the content providers, all of the operating system providers, all of the device makers. Together as a group, that statement's true for any group. As true for operating system makers as it is for broadband operators, broadband ISPs. And those other markets are just as concentrated, have just as high barriers to entry, right, as the market for broadband. The most important point is the incentives of those people to cut off access to the internet are no different from the incentive of broadband providers. Broadband providers survive by providing access to the internet. The notion that they would cut it off is fantastical. Just as fantastical as the notion that Microsoft would. Rob waved at me like 5 minutes ago. I could go on, but I will stop right there and hope that that's provocative enough to generate some questions.
Okay, thank you, Jeff and Michael. I actually didn't think this panel was going to be provocative. I don't know what I was thinking. So we're going to let them provoke each other more. But I wanted to just add a few things after reading Jonathan's paper, and I'll be very brief. I thought this was an excellent paper and really demonstrated, I think, some important new ways of thinking of this. In thinking about it, one of the things that I guess I hungered for a little bit, being a closet academic, was what's the theory or the hypothesis that one could say, if an industry has these following characteristics, you're likely to see a supply chain industry, and if it has these, you're likely to see a circle industry. And I thought you could have done a better job there. Not at all, not on the paper, that's a very good paper. But it struck me that, why don't we see this, for example, in the movie theater industry? Why aren't there Orville Redenbacher movie theaters? You go to a movie theater and you're going to get the best popcorn in the world. Or why aren't there things like Herman Miller movie theaters? We've got the best chairs. You want to watch a movie in our chairs? The Herman Miller theater. And the answer is partly, I think, because it's hard to substitute. It's hard to sort of componentize these things. And so it seems to me there's two, if I can offer, there are two pieces of the theory. One is this notion of interchangeable parts with low cost. But that's really one of the things that's changed. It's easy to put things on with low cost. And the second is it's when the consumer has control. So you mentioned the example of tires, and Bridgestone welded. People don't buy they don't buy a Subaru because they want the Subaru has Bridgestone and Ford has Firestone. But there's certainly capability. You mentioned Intel and the whole notion of Intel inside as it seems to me. I think you underestimate what Dell did, because when you go and now buy your own computer, whether it's Dell or HP or any company, you actually now are choosing certain components. I want the NVIDIA chip as opposed to this other chip, or I want the AMD or the Intel. And that's the ability to do that is you have, it's cheap on the production line for Dell to just say, okay, we're going to put an NVIDIA chip in here versus somebody else's chip. And the consumer can cheaply and easily make those choices. And I think when you have an industry with those two components, then you start talking about a value circle as opposed to a value chain. And that suggests to me that there could be a whole set of other industries that are going to face these same dynamics at some point in the next decade. We could imagine banking being this. We have an application now like Mint, which is an application by Intuit. No reason Mint could not become a bank or an insurance company or anything like that. And certainly cars with the ability, by the way, I don't know if anybody here knows this, it is illegal in the United States for General Motors to sell you a car. It is not illegal for Dell to sell you a computer, but it is illegal for General Motors to sell you a car. Anyone want to guess where those laws came from?
National Dealers Association.
That's exactly right. The National Automobile Dealers Association have passed laws in all 50 states that make it illegal for that. So there's a law that is essentially prohibiting the value circle from emerging in the auto industry because you have one part of this value chain or potential value circle that says we're going to lock in by law our position in there.
It's even worse. Seagram's can't sell me a bottle of gin.
Well, then you got that.
Yes, right.
That's a whole
Even more upset.
That's called the three-tier system for prohibition, another area that needs to change. So I think, so when you think about it, so what are the issues there? I think the issues that come up are, one is, does the consumer assemble or does the company do it, or both? And I think that was Michael's point. I have to say, though, I think that there are advantages to both of those, and I think the debate tends to assume that company assemblages are bad and consumer assemblages are good. And I just think that's not quite accurate, that there are cases where company assemblages are good, and it goes to Jonathan's point about two-sided markets and the benefits of that. Second point is, when you look at sort of what is the U.S. really, really good at, besides having lots of lawsuits, I think one of the things we're really, really good at is business model innovation. I think we're the best country in the world at business model innovation. I'm serving on this China-U.S. Innovation Council, and what's interesting about it is the Chinese are desperate to figure out how to do business model innovation. They really don't know how to do it. They can do component innovation, they're really trying to get to the component innovation, but they have no real sense of how to do business model innovation. And we do, and I think it's partly because our system allows and embraces these kinds of new models coming up. I think the last point I would make is, I think there's this, actually I also have to say, I do have to say that the Comcast level 3 thing I think is much more complicated than, Michael, I think that you were led on. I don't think this is a question of a toll gate. I think this is really a much more complicated question of reciprocal comp and how those things are paid. But my overall point would be, these issues to me are so complex and so fast moving that I think it's very difficult for policymakers, whether it's policymakers who just happen to be staffing this on a committee or policymakers who think about this day in and day out at the FCC or the FTC or DOJ or Commerce or wherever, to really get a hold on, because I just look at this whole, we kind of got the vertical business model in a kind of Alfred Chandlerian way back in the early 1900s, and that was a big new business model, and policymakers took 2 decades to understand what that was about. And here, we're really only less than a decade into this business model, and I think it's just still way, way too early to figure out exactly how it's going to emerge, and what the big threats are, what the big benefits are. So I guess I would kind of go with Jonathan's point about after the fact, we need to look at case-by-case analysis here and not think about overarching broad rules or frameworks yet. I think we're way too early on with that. So with that, Jonathan, I'll let you maybe take 5 minutes and respond to anything I've said or Michael or you here. Or
yeah. So, even Jeff, yes. So thank you guys. I mean, thank you. I'm fine. So thank you very much. I mean, these are very thoughtful comments. I appreciate all the time everybody's put into this. In reading the paper and obviously improving on it. Call my paper Broadband Value Circle 1.0, and this would be a beta drive of it. Let me just comment briefly on points that each have made, and I think they're all correct, but let me explain my views about them. Rob's question of what's the defining characteristic of a value circle. Rob emphasizes cost efficiencies and modularity, among other factors. I think that's true, and I think Rob is right to suggest to me I should have been stronger in explaining what I think the defining characteristic is. In this paper, n equals 2, which to many social scientists would suggest too small a sample size to draw definitive conclusions, but that's why I became a lawyer. Here's what I think is another element, though, and I've tried to bring this up. I don't think it's just on the cost side. I don't think it's just on efficiencies of scale or scope or modularity. I think there's something on the value creation side. In other words, if I had to make a guess, I would say markets that can become value circles are ones where consumers simultaneously take in packages whose elements have strong complementary aspects with each other. In other words, I think the answer to the Herman Miller theory is the purchase or use of a chair isn't strong enough, is not connected tightly enough in a consumer's mind with the act of seeing a movie to make them complementary products so tightly that Herman Miller can speak to the movie watching experience. Whereas I think in the world of the internet, the app speaks as strongly to a experience as the network, and maybe stronger and as the hardware of the device, now the software. I think there's such strength in complementariness that the brands can pose direct challenges to each other by saying to a consumer, you thought you were buying a smartphone, in fact you're buying a thing on which you use apps. And so you can take the apps as the most important part of the value proposition. That's a hypothesis. Secondly, and I agree with Rob, it's worth looking if that's right at other markets where that share similar characteristics. Okay. As to Jeff, this is like, of course listening to Jeff makes me really wish I paid attention to chemistry in high school, but let me say, I mean, Jeff is right about this. So look, we all remember the book Flatlands. We all remember this, right? Beings that lived in two-dimensional space, and big spheres would move through their world, and they didn't see a sphere. They saw slices of circles. They got bigger and bigger and bigger, and smaller and smaller and smaller, because they had a two-dimensional view. There's no question that what I've offered is a two-dimensional view. And it's done for a purpose. It's done because I fear that sometimes when we talk about ecosystems, the ecosystem metaphor hides some of the reality of value creation. In other words, I worry sometimes in an ecosystem, everybody's doing everything. It's like a forest. There's lots of trees. And what I'm trying to bring out in the value circle is that there is a particular market structure to be examined here. So it's correct. Jeff's right. I'm artificially limiting it for the purpose of trying to bring out the point. And he's also right. The core concept, and this goes to my first point as well, is that anybody can be an input. So broadband is not more important than any other characteristic. That's exactly right. Finally, to Michael, I guess I appreciate the comments. It's very thoughtful. I guess the one place where I'm not so sure is this. I'm not sure that competition in the wireless broadband space isn't stronger than your assessment. And for these reasons. It's not obvious to me that Apple and Google are sacrificing in these marketplaces. Let me give you two examples. In 2008, Apple introduced the first 3G iPhone, and it said to AT&T basically, I don't want to cut. I don't know, is Apple a we or is it first or second person? But Apple doesn't take a cut anymore of the revenue from wireless connectivity. Right? In the first generation, it was getting a percentage of what AT&T was making from data sales. In 2008, it gives that up. And it takes a subsidy for the device. There are some commentators at the moment that say it's a mistake. Apple has gone back to an old traditional model. Same day, and I say this in the paper, same day the 3G iPhone is introduced, there's something new that appears from Apple. It's called an apps store. By January of this year, there were 10 billion downloads from the Apple App Store. There was an estimate that Apple's revenue from apps could equal $2 billion in 2011. So did Apple sacrifice by giving away revenue from wireless connectivity? Or did it simply bargain a really good deal in which it was able to empower an app store which not only generated the revenue in and of itself, but very arguably had to be in existence before iPad could be successful, right? Secondly, on Google, it's true that Google created Android for free and it goes away, it gives it away. But, you know, here's what Morgan Stanley said in an investor report in December of last year. On an annualized basis, Google is on track to generate $1 billion plus gross revenue in mobile search, AdMob display, Android apps. Based on this momentum, Google's strategic investments in mobile services and the Android operating system are clearly paying off. Now look, I'm not arguing that there can never be a problem in a marketplace. I think there can be. I think it's important that there be enforcement of antitrust and antitrust-like laws. But I do believe that in the case of both Apple and Google, they've made smart business decisions. And they've done it by opening the aperture of the business models to include things like apps, like building off a free Android platform that perhaps was not in the marketplace before, and thereby providing additional consumer value. So let me just say, those are a few initial comments, but basically I just want to express my thanks to you guys for reading the paper and thinking about it.
I can turn over to the audience. I don't know if Michael and Jeff, if you have other thoughts you wanted to add at this point in response, or
Declare silence.
No, if you have a question.
Let's let them talk.
Yeah.
Or
We can move back to
we can always go ahead.
Yeah.
and why don't we, if you can identify who you are as well. I don't think we have any mics or anything, so just speak out.
I'm John P. Hopp. I've known Jonathan for trying to make sense of value circles. It's complicated and important, but it is also a snapshot in time, right? I'm going to ask you about how dynamic, so as these entities from arguably different markets come together, should we think of these as highly dynamic things or not, and what does that mean for market power? For example, should I think of this as a very complicated system of players that reshuffle the deck and keep parity, or should I think of this as the old-time studios that try and gobble up all pieces of the puzzle in permanent, as permanent a structure as they can get?
So I think you should think about it as a dynamic marketplace where, I don't know how to use the microphone.
Very good.
Does that work?
Yeah.
I think you should think about it as a dynamic marketplace. I think you should think about it as a place where market success is important because it incents innovation and it brings out other competition, where it's likely to be transitory, where it's fast moving. Having said this, though, John, I want to be really careful about this. I'm not saying it's impossible to have market power. I'm not saying that it's impossible to have actions that harm customers and competition. I think it's very important that there be a mechanism that I like a case-by-case approach that looks to see if harm is done and stops it. But my point is simply that there's so much going on, I think it's hard to forecast the source and nature of innovation in advance. So I'm skeptical of prescriptive rules. And I would suggest that in an antitrust-like analysis, my proposition be tested. In other words, I'm not suggesting this become ideology, this dynamic competition, but that in understanding markets, it's really important to look beyond the traditional contours of product market boundaries, or geographic market boundaries, perhaps even, in order to understand what the real forces of competitive pressure are. A very intensive factual examination.
Just add, if you brought that up, we just issued a report probably 3 months ago called Economic Doctrines and Antitrust, where we looked at kind of the prevailing views of antitrust policy and really concluded that what we call the California School of Antitrust, which is sort of folks from Berkeley and Stanford and other folks who have really tried to focus antitrust more on dynamic effects. In other words, the current antitrust approach is maybe a little bit of a parody, but I don't think it's too much, is to take a snapshot of an industry and say, aha, something's going on or not, and it looks bad or it looks good. And I think one of the things that's been missing, although it's been changing in the last 5 years or so, is that we need a much more dynamic look at antitrust, that these markets are evolving quite rapidly, that they're very different than the wheat and barley markets, which don't change very much, and these dynamic effects. And I think that's partly why this gives people a lot of pause on no matter what their sort of political view of this is. These are changing so fast, they're so uncertain. They're like, wow, this is a lot different than the wheat or barley markets. We don't know what's going to happen, and maybe something bad's going to happen. Maybe some new monopoly will occur. And the thing is, we just don't know. And I think John's point about case by case is one certainly we would agree with. Other comments, questions?
Well, while people are thinking, let me jump in with what you were just talking about, and this will bring Michael back to Mark too. So, I'll start with this. I was astonished to hear Michael lauding the competitive and innovative wireline broadband marketplace, which last time we talked I thought was a cozy duopoly, so there was a little cognitive dissonance for me in that. But that leads me, happy to take a little bit of what you've got, leads me to, I know Michael will reciprocate, which leads me to a more substantive point, right? And the point is your emphasis on the word dynamic. So innovation doesn't just happen. Okay? Innovation happens because somebody invests. A lot of times people invest and nothing good comes of it. When they do invest, they end up with something called a sunk cost. So I spend a lot of money and I create an operating system. Or I spend a lot of money and I build a fab that makes chips. or I spend a lot of money and I build a cell phone network. And now I've got something that I put X billion dollars into, and the cost of an additional person using it is damn near zero. I can churn out chips for not very much, and I can carry minutes of cell phone use for nothing. And I can print copies of my operating system for zero. So I gotta, you know, if I sell it for what it cost me to make it, I didn't invest in it in the first place. Right? I never took the time to invent the thing, to issue the patent, to never happened. Right? All that stuff only happens because somebody was successful in charging more than marginal cost for it at the end of the day. Typically, in these markets, they were price discriminating. Ugly word, right? I'm supposed to testify before the California Public Service Commission on a case later this year, and I'm trying to decide if I can use the word discrimination in that room without getting called out of the handcuffs, you know, before I can make my point. Price discrimination. The point of all of this is that in all of these markets, and broadband is no different, you gotta be able to find somebody willing to pay you more than it costs you to make it, or you don't make the investment in the first place. You gotta be able to price discriminate. And that's where Michael and I completely get on different buses, right? We're on completely different sides. Michael is happy to have, up to a point at least, Intel price discriminating, or Microsoft price discriminating, or Google price discriminating. Right? Google is the most sophisticated price discrimination mechanism in history. Their auction model is intellectual property worth more. It is the reason they're so profitable, is they're sucking every penny of value out of everybody paying for a click on the Google search engine. Right? Price discrimination is what drives innovation. Right? Product differentiation. I got to make something different and better that creates value for somebody who's willing to pay me a lot more than it costs, because I've got this huge sunk cost in the form of either research and development or CapEx or both. Michael's view is that in the broadband space, somehow that doesn't matter, right? Because what we need to do is we need to do the equivalent in intellectual property space of compulsory licensing everything. Right? Taking away all of Microsoft's patent and copyright rights and forcing it to open its system to anybody and everybody who wants to use it or resell it, right? At some wholesale price related to cost, related to marginal cost. And the same across the entire, if you take all of Michael's policy prescriptions for broadband, I would just ask you to ask yourself the question in all of these open access proposals, Michael's and others. Every time you hear somebody saying, let's have open access on the broadband pipe, ask yourself, what distinguishes the market for chips? What distinguishes the market for social networks? What distinguishes the market for any of these other products? That open access is good in this environment, but the equivalent of open access would be bad in any of those environments.
Maybe we should let Michael respond to that. My example you should use in California on price discrimination is ladies' night free at bars. I mean, egregious price discrimination that makes me mad because it means that.
I'll be in jail for sure. I'm not talking about bars. You're trying to get me all the way.
You raised sleep rooms, Jeff. You opened the door.
I know. Sin City is arrived.
Michael,
It's only 12:30.
you feel free. You don't have to.
All right. So, well, Jeff mentioned, no, he mentioned, and when he was up there, made some, good points about how, I think he was referring to you as well. We're being too broadband centric, and that there's, that there could be, problems in these, in these other product market, within these other product markets that are part of this ecosystem. If Facebook has, is gaining a monopoly over social networking or Google over search or whatever. But I think, I guess I'll plead, I mean, it's a good point, you can look at those, but I'll plead guilty to being, most concerned about the platform. The platform on which, in a sense, the ecosystem is operating and evolving. So for example, I actually don't think that the so wireline broadband, I don't think it's, necessarily robustly competitive if most people have one or two choices, but that actually doesn't concern me as much when it's open for all the other product markets to compete and make these combinations. So it concerns me a lot more. It's similar with, so for example, I don't worry so much about if there was if General Motors had a monopoly on vans. It wouldn't bother me so much as long as the roads are open, because then we can have all kinds of vehicles that have all kinds of applications that can be complements and substitutes and so on. I worry most about that the roads are open, and so to me, like whether it's Google, Facebook, all these individual companies, they are just in a sense part of what's on top of this, and it's certainly important, but it's not. I think it's not fundamental, and there are certain things that are the platform for inputs into everything else. And whether you're talking about electricity, the internet, transportation systems, and so on, that's where you need and that's probably where we more fundamentally disagree, is just on the basic principle of common carriage. When things are an input into everything else, they need to be open for these ecosystems to develop. And that was my fundamental complaint about mobile broadband and sort of using the iPhone to celebrate its great, whether or not, using it as evidence that it's now a fully developed value circle, because I think it's not nearly as open to the possibilities to optimize the consumer welfare as either the wireline broadband ecosystem or what's on top of that, the video programming marketplace, as it appears to be evolving.
I didn't imagine that we were. I mean, this is like we could just do this for another couple of hours. Get into this debate on wireless and is it open or not and all. I do think one analogy though on wireless, it's a little different. I think one has to, and John, I don't think you made this point in your piece either, which is that you have underlying technical differences between networks that enable them to do certain things. And I think the wireless analogy is more along the lines of and the road analogy, because you can imagine a road where we don't let Maseratis on them because they just go so fast that they screw up the traffic patterns on the road. So we have a Maserati ban, or in this case, we have a speed limit. There's another way to think about that. And that is, I think, one of the differences between a wireless network and a wireline network, because they have underlying different characteristics, at least in the 3G world and potentially even in the 4G world. But again, the question is, how do you? And maybe this leads to my last question, and then we'll break, which is, if we're looking at each of these systems, whether it's in this box or this cube, or whether it's three-dimensional and there's content and transport and device and app, are there some principles by which policymakers can say, okay, this is more or less some principle that I'd like to adhere to, as opposed to a rule? I think rules are where we go wrong, but I think sort of guiding principles of saying, what, we think in general we want to have these kind of behaviors and these structures, because we think that's going to optimize consumer value. And I guess I'd add, by the way, at the end of the day, what we want to optimize is productivity and innovation. I'm less interested in optimizing producer value. Producer value is a means, not an end. I think we have to always remember that. We only want producer value to the extent it enables the producers to do something. It's not something we care about, because I don't care about producer value. Producer value is a means to providing societal end. So I just maybe, John, you maybe start with that, and then Michael and Jeff, if are there some core principles that we should be thinking about?
So let me offer two. One is, I think we want, in a broad sense, I want to come back to broad sense, we want open markets, right? We want the ability to bring different value propositions to market. I do want to make a distinction here, though. An open marketplace doesn't require that every possible combination be offered. There's nothing wrong with exclusivity. There's nothing wrong with companies, somebody having an operating system that only works on its own devices, as long as the market is broadly delivering competitive choices. In fact, and I do a little piece of my paper, having a difference between a proprietary operating system and one that's offered on open source may itself be a form of competition, which is a good thing. So we clearly want in a broad sense, open markets, that ought to be a principle of behavior. It ought to inform how we protect consumers and competition from harm. But I don't think we should confuse it with the ability of innovative business models to incent investment and partnership from other firms through different kinds of business arrangements. Secondly, I think we have to know that we don't know a lot. And I think I mean this seriously. With innovation coming at us from so many different angles, whether it's a circle, an ecosystem, whatever, how many dimensions one wishes, physics or biology, as the metaphor, I think it's important for policymakers to understand that it's very difficult, I would say impossible, to predict the next source of innovation, and that therefore to decide in advance where investment needs to go is a very tricky proposition, and that it's better to try to provide rules of large principles of conduct and then take action. Because the one thing we can't afford to do, I would say, in this economy is to inadvertently shut off forms of innovation from coming to the market or to consumers.
I mean, the Rumsfeld doctrine.
It is really, it's serious. No, I mean, it's a lot like it. It is.
Michael?
I thought, yeah, in terms of principles, I thought, Rob threw out two very good ones when he made his initial remarks, which we heard, the first one from Jeff as well. Modularity, and substitutability is one, and another is consumer choice. Although hearing what Jonathan just said, then I should acknowledge then there's some tension. So, for example, on the modularity, substitutability, there could be tension between, for example, having a choice between the closed model and the open model. And that's where I think I would come back again to a little bit to the distinction I was, trying to press with Jeff about the difference between, what is kind of fundamentally the platform for innovation, what you might call the common carrier, and what are all the other components, the other product markets that are, combining on top of that. Because, for example, whereas, I think it's great to have the iPhone and Android competing, right? The one is largely a closed model. So, for example, if you have an iPhone, you can't just go on the internet and get any application you want. You can only get applications that are pre-approved by Apple and pay them 30%. Whereas on an Android, you can get pretty much anything that will operate on a device you can find that you can find on the internet. You can use. So that's good to have those not necessarily interoperate with each other, but I think that's different. At the same time that we would want the wireless networks themselves to be able to interoperate with each other and with any device that anybody would make for that. And that's the Carter phone idea.
Jeff?
Let me start with 2 quick points. First of all, there's a $39 billion merger between AT&T and T-Mobile, and then today we found out about the $8.5 billion merger between our acquisition of Skype by Microsoft. I'm tempted to ask for a showing of hands, but if I were teaching my regulated industries class, I might put a multiple choice question on the final exam, and it'd be an easy one because you have a 50% chance of getting it right by flipping a coin. Which of the 2 mergers will have a more profound effect on the market for voice telephone service 5 years from now? Or says more about the shape of that market, right? The answer, I hope everybody having listened to this gets the point, the answer is the Skype merger with Microsoft, right? Because what is happening is the commoditization of the voice telephone market, right? We already have a Google Voice application on every screen, on the Google search engine screen. We're about to have a Skype voice application every time we boot up and look at our Microsoft home screen. Right? So what we're seeing, this has been talked about for a long time, the notion of applications, voice becoming a free app on the internet. Look out Verizon. It just did. Or it didn't just, but the process is being much accelerated. What does that have to do with kind of principles? The principle that I think that brings home is that all of these modules and platforms are competing both horizontally and vertically amongst themselves. And it is time to recognize that all of them are being treated according to one antitrust regime or set of antitrust principles, with one exception, and the exception is infrastructure companies. Okay. So if I'm right, and I think I am, that from an economic perspective, the broadband platform is no different from the iPhone, iPad, iTunes platform, or the Microsoft platform, or the Google platform, or the Intel platform. If I'm right, then in fact what we have is competition among platforms, all of them in this three-dimensional space. Then it's time to move, as Joe Farrell and Phil Weiser argued for in 2003, a very important article about modularity in the internet. Then it is time to move as rapidly as possible to integrate the policy principles, the antitrust principles, that govern competition among them. As Jonathan said, I think we all agree. You know, I thought Microsoft was, I thought there were problems with Microsoft, and said so. I spent a lot of time writing about the Microsoft case. It is not that there's no, and believing that Microsoft was, you know, in fact had committed exclusionary acts. So it's not that bad acts can never happen or harm consumers. It's that there ought to be one consistent set of principles that applies across the board, and the antitrust principles are the right principles for doing that.
Great. So I want to thank Jonathan for that excellent paper and the overview of it, and I'm looking forward to 2.0. Nice thing about what we can do. And I think I want modularity on that too, because I want to be able to add sections of the paper anonymously. Not because I'm embarrassed, but I want to be able to put it in there without, you know, you're not editing it.
So
Well, you'll have hidden links to your website.
my view is Alexander Hamilton got to be anonymous in the Federalist Papers, so you can be anonymous.
I'll be Publius.
Yes, exactly.
So, and I also want to thank Michael and Jeff. So please, and thank you for all for coming. So please join me in thanking the great man.